historian is Peter Linebaugh. So Peter is a professor at the University of Toledo. Toledo is not in Spain, it's in Ohio, the US. But Professor Linebaugh is an expert in British history and Irish history, labor history, and is a well-known critique of welfare capitalism. And he very often contributes to public discussions about social justice in the US and beyond. So his presentation today is based on his most recent book, well, one of his recent books, on the Magna Carta. He will tell, of course, he will tell us much more about that in a minute. He's in Belgium, in Brussels, these days at the invitation of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. Very well-known foundation, and he will also give a talk tonight in Brussels. So what we will proceed as follow. Renato from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, Renato Sabatini from the foundation will briefly present the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. He will also say a few words about why Peter Linebaugh is in Europe, Brussels these days. And then I will give the floor to Peter for 40 minutes. We'll have a break, and then you'll have opportunities to ask questions after the break. Okay? So, Renato, the floor is yours.
Good morning. Yes, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation is a German political foundation. In Germany, there are several political foundations which are loosely associated with the different political parties. The Rosa Luxemburg Foundation is associated with the party Die Linke, the left. Rosa Luxemburg, I don't know how many of you know this, but Rosa Luxemburg was a German, an extraordinary lady of Jewish-Polish origin, who then naturalized into German. And she was basically a Marxist theorist, a philosopher, and a socialist revolutionary. She founded, together with Karl Liebknecht, the Spartacus League, which then became the Communist Party in Germany. She was very active in the second decade of the 20th century, and she was murdered under, let's say, the auspices of the social democratic government of that time, led by Friedrich Ebert, with the aid of the Freikorps, which were militias made of veterans of the First World War, after the crushing of the Spartacus uprising. Rosa Luxemburg dealt a lot with the issue of the relationship also between equality and freedom, which nowadays in the political discourse tend at times to be represented as two different, very different issues in oppositions with one another. So I think it is very fitting that it's Rosa Luxemburg Foundation invited Peter Linebaugh to Brussels to explore this issue, particularly in connection with the theme of the common goods. The Rosa Luxemburg Foundation has been organizing in the last 3 years several conferences and initiatives on the issue of common goods. You may have heard that particularly it's a very hot subject in the social movements. It started particularly with battles against the privatization of water, particularly in Latin America. And now it's one of the topic which is of most interest. So we would like to explore, and this we will do tonight in a public lecture where you're all, of course, very welcome to come at 6:30 p.m. at the International Auditorium, which is also known as Maison du Syndicat, here in Boulevard du Roi Albert II, at the number 5. And one last point, the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, like all the German political foundations, is funded by public money. The projects it carries out are made thanks to the contribution of the Ministry of Cooperation in this case. So, which is why we would we need, of course, to prove to our founder that the initiatives really took place. And so one of the means by which we do this is that we usually provide also then the ministry with the list of participants to the initiative. So we will circulate a piece of paper. You are not. We would kindly ask you to put your name and sign it. You don't need to put your email if you don't like to. I mean, that is really up to you. But we just need the name and a signature to prove that this event took place, because otherwise they say yes, but you say you organized the event, but who was there? So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Renato, for having made this possible. So now I would like to thank especially Peter for being here today, and I give you the floor for the minutes, okay? Thank you very much. Thank you. Is that enough?
Yeah.
Yes, thank you very much, Professor, for your kind words of introduction. And thank you, Renato, for the invitation from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. And especially thank you for reminding all of us who Rosa Luxemburg was. I am deeply honored to be here in Europe. Hear her name spoken, it fills my heart. I remember reading her diaries when she was in prison. I remember when she was younger than some of you in Poland, and there was a hanging in the prison, and as a student in high school, she wrote against this hanging, and was expelled from high school, or got in trouble with the principal. So as a young woman, I think in the 1880s, she had already embarked on a path of courage and social change. In 2012, to hear a German foundation speak of her in Western Europe also fills me with some hope. I myself am carry an American passport. My mother and father were diplomats of the USA. I have learned to call myself a child of empire. And thus perhaps have kinship with some kinds of Northern Europeans. Staying in a hotel that's adjacent to the Hotel of Colonies, King Leopold. Makes me remember Mark Twain, the great American humorist, and his devastating writing about the atrocities, the cutting of the hands of the proletarians of Congo in the rubber trees. So, as an American, I feel a kinship with children of empire in Europe and of the amends that and the difficulty of discovering the truth of our past. My past, of the USA, is a history of robbery and enslavement. And these are less slogans than they are fundamental axioms of the history of a hypothesis for research and for rediscovery Because as Walter Benjamin taught us, history has belonged to the victors. But history is being rewritten by the commoners of the world, and I am proud to belong to that project. I was in Brussels once before at a display of commodities, of worldwide commodities, in 1958 at the World's Fair here in Brussels. My father drove me here. I was a high school student and I attended the United States Pavilion, where they displayed a fashion. It was a fashion show. And I also went to the Soviet Pavilion as a 15-year-old and obtained a pin there of Lenin. This was part of my rebellion against the American Empire and a childish or adolescent statement of allegiance. But as you know, to get to Brussels from Bonn, well, I don't really know what the driving was, but it was not far from the birthplace of Karl Marx in Trier, which was at the northern edge of the Roman Empire. And to this day, I believe there's a great gate in Trier that the young Karl Marx walked by every day on his way to school. And I imagine him thinking of the commoners of Northern Europe as he was studying the Latin of Southern Europe. But be that as it may, as a brilliant student, like yourselves perhaps, he wished to change the world and lost himself in the world of ideas until he was brought down to the ground in his parents' natal, until brought down to the ground in the Moselle Valley, where the wine is from. Do you drink the wine from the Moselle Valley? May I please see a show of hands of those who sometimes drink the Moselle wine? Thank you. Thank you. That's a sober crowd here today. See? But his parents owned a small vineyard, or had to share in a small vineyard. And when the big companies moved in to make an export of the wood, of the forests of the Moselle, they did not want to have the peasantry or the common people mucking about in the forest. So big companies then, very much like now, caused the government of the Rhineland to pass statutes forbidding the gathering of wood in the forests. And Karl Marx was interested in this, and he wrote about it as a young journalist. And it was this investigation that was the first time that he paid attention to what he called material subjects, or the material life of the people. And his philosophy, whether it's historical materialism or the economics or the revolutionism of Karl Marx, had this as its beginning: the criminalization of customary rights of poor people, or commoners, to forest wood. This doesn't mean they could bring in their chainsaws and cut down all the trees. No, it meant that they could take windfalls, or on special occasions, certain types of wood for particular purposes. And these purposes and types of wood, I will not go into here right now, at least not in the Moselle. Anyway, this is by way of the introduction of my subject. And my subject, I never thought I would come to it because I thought it was such a bourgeois subject, such a middle-class subject when I was growing up. And that is the Magna Carta. This is my subject. And it's this subject that, how many have heard of the Magna Carta? May I have a show of hands? Oh, excellent. Excellent. So you, good. And how many of you have studied Latin? Oh, I'm here in Europe. This is amazing. I am an American. I had not heard of any of this. And I know nothing about Latin. My friend Ian will translate for me from time to time. But as I understand it, this Magna Carta, it means big something. Big charter, doesn't it? But it's actually, it's not that big. Have any of you seen it? You know, it's just about like this, just a few centimeters. And it's written in a very tiny hand, minuscule. And it's written in Latin. And it has 61 different chapters. And today I'm only going to tell you about some of them. And I'm going, and this, yes, take notes on this, please. The most important one is 39. But before getting to it, let me toss out a few others. Chapter 7 is important. And then, excuse me while I consult my notes. Oh yes, 47, 48, 52. These are quite important, I think, for our future. And the climax of them is, if I'm not mistaken, it's 61. Yes. And as you know, we historians love dates. What is the date of Magna Carta? If you know, raise your hand. 1215. Very good. By any chance, you know the rest, the time of the month? Okay. What did you say? 1215. All right. 1215. 15th of June, 1215. All right. Okay. At this point, I will get to chapter 39. Chapter 39 has four principles, or four provisions, which we need to study with the pedantry of the historian, the passion of the poet, and the care of the lawyer. I will read the entire chapter. Nullus liber homo, it begins. Or in English, no free man shall be seized, imprisoned, or stripped of his rights and possessions, or outlawed, or exiled, or deprived of his standing in any other way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals and the law of the land. Got that? I'd be surprised. So I shall try to summarize it in 4 modern principles, because that chapter has evolved to the point now it's cited in New Zealand, in Tel Aviv, in Washington, in Johannesburg, this very chapter as fundamental law, really. The 4 principles are habeas corpus, another Latin term. Do I need to translate it? I think it's complex to translate. This means, I think, having the body, or something like that. It's not really a sentence, but it's evolved over history. Oh, hang on, what's history? Yeah, let's just have a quick thing about history. This chapter evolved in relationship to the English Revolution, in relationship to the American War of Independence, in relationship to the American Civil War, and in relationship to the great anti-fascist war, or World War II. These 4 historical episodes have been the crucibles throughout time that have caused this medieval document to become principles of fundamental law.
Habeas corpus.
This is the law that says you cannot be detained, you cannot be locked up, you cannot be imprisoned unless charges have been made against you. No preventive detention, no locking up suspects without saying why. This had been a writ of the sheriffs to give to the jailer, to explain, to demand, release the prisoner unless you can show cause why you're holding him or her. Do you follow? This really is the principle that has been violated systematically since 2001 in the United States. That is, people are locked up, people are detained without charges being levied against them. The second principle that comes from chapter 39 is the prohibition of torture. And from the United States, it is especially necessary that this phrase be reintroduced to the country that has the largest prisoner population in the world, and whose crimes of torture and cruelty under the pretense of investigating truth have been the shame of humans all over, from Abu Ghraib, I'm speaking of, the prison in Iraq. I pause. The third principle from Magna Carta, chapter 39, is somewhat more hopeful, thank goodness. is the principle of trial by jury? And I would like to pause with that principle for a minute. The jury is random, is a selection of government by randomizing. That you will be judged by your equals, but the individuals will be randomly selected from your locale. I'm very tempted at this. Do you remember when we spoke about the Moselle Valley? And I told you I was not going to discuss what kind of trees or what kind of purposes the commoners went into the forest for. Remember, this was at the time of the Brothers Grimm. Do you remember them? They were the ones who collected the folklore and fairy tales of the foresters and the commoners at that same time that Karl Marx was investigating the material conditions. But let's forget the Brothers Grimm and forget Karl Marx and just imagine ourselves as commoners going into the forest to gather kindling or gather dead wood for our fires, for our cooking. But some commoners might take too much, or other commoners might saw off or knock or chop down trees that they shouldn't, that are still growing. It is the jury that would decide when the commoner transgressed in the commons. Do you follow? This principle of self-government and local government was inherent in the jury of the Middle Ages. This jury still survives in England and in the United States and in many other countries as a process of criminal discovery. But I want to, at this point, to insert this other principle that the jury performed, which was a principle of the governance of the commons. And you will know the woman, the first woman who was awarded the Nobel Prize for Economics, don't you? Who was she? Well, students, she was Eleanor Ostrom. She won the Nobel Prize for Economics in the year 2009. And her subject was the governance of the commons. So I would, oh, the commons. But this lecture is supposed to be about the Magna Carta, isn't it? This evening's lecture will be about the commons. But they're connected. And now, oh, I must move on. But first, let me complete this. I said 4 principles, didn't I, in chapter 39. The 4th one is due process of law. Or, actually, law of the land. Or due process of law. Do you study, by any chance, constitutions of other countries? No? All right. Okay, so those, I'll say those are the 4 principles from chapter 39. Now I want to quote from Karl Marx. I was asked ahead of time to refer to Karl Marx when possible in this lecture, so this is why I do so. In 1848, Karl Marx said that in place of the pompous catalogue of the inalienable rights of man comes a modest Magna Carta of a legally limited working day. He was writing, referring to the 10 hours bill that was passed by the English Parliament, limiting for some classes of workers the working day to just 10 hours. And he called it a modest Magna Carta, as opposed to the pompous, inalienable rights of man, which you can read about in the Bill of Rights of the US Constitution, or you can read about in the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen of the French Revolution. What was significant to Karl Marx is that he again returned to material conditions of ordinary people, of limiting the amount of time that we are exploited, or the amount of time that we have to work. And I hope very much that I can end today's lecture with a peroration, isn't that the climax? And give an ode to rest. Okay, to relaxing. In fact, I need to relax a little bit at this point. And we'll all have a chance to relax with a break. Now, where was I? Oh yes, Karl Marx was referring to material conditions. Now, permit me one other digression, will you? I know I'm hard to follow, but there is a logic, and if we can pay attention, maybe something can come out of it. In 2001, President Bush, he went to Congress and he talked to Tony Blair and Mrs. Blair. And he talked to all the Supreme Court justices and all the senators and all the big wigs, the power and the mighty, the generals and Air Force people, all of them in it, and to announce his war on terror. And he was so excited by his war on terror. He compared himself to Franklin Roosevelt. And he compared Tony Blair, who was sitting up in the balcony, to Winston Churchill himself. And he was comparing, oh, his war on terror. He was so excited about it. He was comparing it to the defeat of the Nazis and the fascists during World War II. And I turned on the television to watch this speech. And he said, we're fighting for freedom. And I said, oh, good. We're fighting for the freedom of speech. And we're fighting for the freedom of religion. And that was it. That was it. And I looked, the camera panned, and I was looking for some gray hairs who would remember World War II. But it wasn't just 2 freedoms, was it? It was 4 freedoms. President Bush had forgotten. He couldn't have done a very good history course. You will not be in that position, because you will know the 4 freedoms. Freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and then comes what? Freedom from fear and freedom from want. Freedom from fear, freedom from want. These were the 4 freedoms enunciated by Franklin Roosevelt at the commencement of World War II. They were enunciated in January, February, and April of 1941. And they became the slogans for the Allied forces. Freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. This is what Bush mentioned, and he excised, he took out the freedom from fear and the freedom from want. He was rewriting history in this speech. I was astonished. And okay, so you might, And it has nothing to do with the fact that I was a historian, or please don't call me an antiquarian, because this is the generation that had preceded us. Okay. Freedom from fear depends on not being tortured. It depends on not being arrested or seized or thrown into prison. It depends on being judged by our peers. And it depends on the rule of law. Bush had not been taught Chapter 39. And it took several years before even the Supreme Court justices were willing to recognize that the prisoners in Guantanamo Bay who had been seized and detained should be brought to trial. And if they were not brought to trial, they were in violation of Magna Carta and habeas corpus. You will not make that mistake. If some of you should sit on the seats of justice. It was this that caused me to become interested in Magna Carta. Do you follow? Thank you. Thank you for the encouragement. And now, sir, I will get back to the Latin. Remember, it says we agreed that it was big charter, even though physically it was little. But there were two charters. There was a second charter that was smaller. This one had 61 chapters. The other one has only 16. What happened? Well, here's what happened. These charters were an armistice to a civil war that was taking place in what's now England. These 61 chapters were an armistice between the monarchy and the church, between the king and the barons, between Christians and Jews, between husbands and wives, between commoners and privatizers, between the individual and the state. The 61 was an attempt through all those social groups, see, it's not just all those social groups, to find an equilibrium, or at least a peace, to stop war. But King John, who did not sign it, now, we can speak with some pride as scholars. We are fellow scholars. We know that human knowledge is passed by writing and reading, among other ways. King John could not write. He didn't sign it. The rulers, he was a man of war, a man of force. They didn't write. So King John did not sign this, but he agreed to it. He said, okay, I agree. But he had his fingers crossed behind his back. And war resumed. And he was going along in Lincolnshire when the North Sea tide came in unexpectedly upon the Wash. And King John and all his baggage got soaked, and he was lucky to survive a drowning. And he went looking for a place because he was soaking wet. He banged on the door of a monastery. And they opened it, the door. And King John was invited in to warm himself by the fire, and then was offered a meal, because the monks did not ask questions. They first made sure you were comfortable and offered you simple hospitality. And King John said, how much was this bread? 1 penny, sire. Before I'm done, it will be 12 pence, he said. And there was a young monk in the back of the hall who said his time had come. And he approached the king and said, "Sire, may I offer you a sweet?" And King John said yes. And the monk went out into the orchard and plucked a plum. He opened the plum, took out the pit, and inside it he put poison, and then put the plum back together and took it to the king and said, "King, please eat." And King John said, "No, you eat first, monk." So the monk took the plum, or half the plum, and ate it. The king then took the other half and ate it. The monk turned blue and fell down dead. Then the king fell down dead. And that's the end of King John. The plum in the orchard was a commons to the region, had come from Syria, come back with the Crusaders. You might say that King John was done in by a suicide bomber, couldn't you? Well, with the death of King John, they went looking for Magna Carta, and they found it along with a second charter. And they found it, and this is the date. This is what got me so interested. In a kind of magical way, I thought that the gods of history were working for us for a change. Excuse me, this is total superstition I'm about to offer, but it was on the 11th of September, 1217, that the charter was refound, and a second charter with it, called the Charter of the Forest. The Magna Carta had been amended in its chapter 7 to grant to the widow her reasonable estovers in the common. Her reasonable estovers in the common. And this, down in his shoe, is the essence of my lecture to you today. Can be found in this expression, estovers. For what are estovers? Who knows? It is my pleasure to explain it to you. We already have a hint with Karl Marx, remember, in the Moselle Valley. I don't know whether his mom and dad went and gathered wood for their fire, or whether wood was gathered at his school to warm the classrooms. But to gather wood from the forest I didn't say that right, sorry. Don't write that down. Instead, write down the power to gather wood in the forest. Is an estover. I didn't say the right to gather it, though we might. I don't know enough of the philosophies here to know, but I know there is an important distinction. It was a community, a village power, a village right, often not understood in writing, but by the elders of any particular village, to decide for what purposes could you gather wood. Could you gather wood to repair a rake handle? Could you gather wood for a roof? Could you gather wood for fuel? Could you gather other woodland substances when you had a cold for aspirin? Could you gather for other harms? The woodland was a pharmacopoeia, a place. The woodland had many, many aspects, but the Estovers was the power of the commoner to gather wood for her substance, and the Magna Carta specified that the widow, the elderly woman, might gather wood. Reasonable Estovers, it says reasonable, in the common. So here's how the Magna Carta introduces the word common in chapter 7. It wasn't in the 1215 version, but in the 11th of September 1217 one. Together they are called the Great Charters of English Liberty. Now, to this day, you go to England and you go to the United States, and they'll just say Magna Carta. It won't occur to them, as it does to you as Latin students, that if they call it a big charter, there must have been a little one. The little one, the Charter of the Forest, describes, not in an ecological way, but in a social way, that the king may not take the forest to himself, but he must share it with those who are commoning in the forest. And it provides provisions for doing this, including that principle of the jury, that when there's a dispute, there will be a term that the English call, I was going to say regrators, but that's not the right word. I forget what the word is, but it's like a jury. It's the 12 people from that forest, from that village. And by the way, how's the time going? 5 minutes? Okay. By the way, this is not as far-fetched and antiquarian and silly as you might think. I mean, at first, when I was doing this, I couldn't keep Monty Python out of my head. Do you know Monty Python and the Holy Grail?
Yeah.
Okay. You know, I thought I was doing this sort of thing. What was Estovers and... Okay. Yeah, the Tory government in 2009 had a Public Lands Act. They wanted to go and privatize the Forest of Dean. But the Forest of Dean people had learned about the Charter of the Forest recently at the Bristol Radical History Association, and had begun to organize against the selling off of the Forest of Dean. And the commoners of the Forest of Dean then demanded that the Tory minister of whatever, not the interior, but of something, come and explain this and withdraw this bill. And when he came to the forest, the commoners threw egg in his face. And they protested and had demonstrations. They didn't drive their tractors, as I understand is happening in Brussels today. But they made a fuss, and the Tories were forced to withdraw this. And they did this in defense, not just of their Estovers, but in defense of another fundamental right, or fundamental power. And that is the right of agistment. That is, or we might say, herbage. That's to let a cow graze in the forest. So you can have your milk, your butter, your cheese. You follow. If you're a poor person, you might not have money, you might not have much land, but you might not have really any land. But if you belong to that locale, you could put a cow in the forest. And in that cow is like roast beef. But more important is milk. And butter. No, really. And cheese. I'm speaking of survival, eh? But I want to whet your appetite. Just to make it real. You know, these medieval things. This is the subsistence economy. It's a common. It's part of the commons. Okay, that's the Estovers. Now, if there's, oh man, there's so much to say. It's in this very good book, the Magna Carta Manifesto, Liberties, and which I would like to give to you. Professor, where are you? Yes. So may I make this as a gift to the university or to however you commonly see fit? All right, good. So much of what I hope to be able to say, I will not really have time to say, but you can find in here, complete with a glossary. There are many, many other subsistence things. The Commons has a nomenclature in English that is really, it's like a foreign language. You know, there's chiminage, there's panage, but I don't need to go into all of that. I don't need to. It's, that might be, at this point in today's lecture, that might be truly the antiquarian. Instead, I want to speak about 47, 48, and 52, and with the corresponding ones in the Charter of the Forest. These provisions of Magna Carta are essential for us because it says not only do we have the power to gather reasonable leftovers in the common, but, Mr. King, you must return what you have taken. This, I think, is essential for us. In other words, going forward into the future, the 21st century future, it's not enough to revive the commons as a means of commoning our poverty. We get back to Rosa Luxemburg, don't we? That is, we get back to the Marxism that we know, that human society is class society. And in 1215, the king who would wish to hoard the means of life and nature to himself was forced to return, to disafforest, to use the expression found in Magna Carta, to return what had been unlawfully taken. This is the principle that for us we call reparations. It's restorative justice. It's not enough to say, I'm sorry and we'll never do it again. No, no, no. You have to return your ill-gotten goods. So that's the, that's that. 61, of course, is the right of resistance, the power of resistance. When and so I'll conclude with a personal note. I hope I can remember it. It was in my mind there a minute ago. Oh yeah, I went to Brussels in 1958. Just that year earlier, the American military machine, allied with a legal machine, decided to pay obeisance to Magna Carta, and they went over to England and they built a monument. And if you have a long layover at Heathrow, you can take a bus over to Runnymede and look at this monument. I don't particularly recommend it, though, but if it's a summer day, it's a nice excursion. And there the Americans put a plinth. You know, that's a phallic-like stone post. And on this post is they wrote, the American imperialists, the American militarists, they wrote freedom under law, Magna Carta. This is the exact opposite of what Magna Carta says. It's not freedom under law, it's authority under law. You will not find a single provision that says freedom is under law. This was an interpretation of the Cold War era, do you see? And I called the Americans militarists, didn't I? And perhaps some of you might have thought, well, I know some American soldiers, they're not that bad. And, you know, I quite agree. But the American generals, the American officers, where's the chalk? What did they put on this plinth? You know, here they had, you know, freedom under law. which is a lie. And instead they put up here, I'm not sure I can draw it. They put up here a star. But this has no significance in English heraldry or semiotics. This is the sign of the United States Air Force. So here's the U.S. Air Force, you see, planting itself on Magna Carta and on England, totally forgetting what it's all about, and trying instead to invert the meaning of Magna Carta. So that's the personal story that I wanted to tell you, because when I went to Linebaugh, I thought I was writing this book, I should go and see the place. And this is what I found. I was utterly shocked. Aren't you? Isn't it amazing? Isn't it amazing? You know, the work that you're doing is so important. Writing things down, what you're studying now. Because these rulers, they know no shame. They know no shame. So with our hands outstretched, we'll welcome them. We'll welcome one another to our discussions. And with our arms folded, we will refuse to budge. The folded arms of the workers. And with our finger of shame, we will point out our enemies. And exposed as we are, we will seek protection in the solidarity of our fist. That's my conclusion. Cool, huh? 4 gestures. All right. So let's have a break.